Now, while that debt summit was in progress, Zambia announced barely 24 hours ago that it had struck a debt restructuring deal that covers the bulk of its $13 billion of debt. Now, under the terms of that deal, bilateral lenders will extend their loans by over 20 years, providing a 3-year grace period on interest payments as well. So Zambia says it has the outlines of a deal, and we'll get the firm details once the MOU is published. But questions around the poor performance of the G20 common framework still remain. Zambia, remember, did default in November 2020. So why has it taken this long to get a deal in place? That's when my conversation with the CEO of Development Reimagined, Ryder, began.
The blame has been assigned on the idea that there are creditors that are not joining a particular table, which is the G20 Common Framework table. But fundamentally, it comes down to the problem that it is certain creditors feel that they need to know about other creditors in order to make their decisions on debt relief and debt restructuring, which actually is nonsensical. The creditors need to make their own decisions as to whether they can provide debt relief or debt restructuring based on what they have agreed with those countries. And so it is this kind of recalcitrance, in a sense, sort of finding excuses almost not to move ahead when they could move ahead, but in partnership with the borrowers. So I think there is a big shift that's needed, and it's a shift in thinking, both in terms of the creditors themselves, but also the borrowers, to say, look, we cannot have this suggestion that creditors need to be in the room every time. We need to be able to also have bilateral discussions if that makes sense, or we need to be working with the private sector directly to really understand what they need from us. Why not? Let's make it happen.
One of the things that the World Bank president has proposed at this summit is essentially moving towards a sort of standstill on debt in the event that's triggered by specific exogenous shocks. Climate change is the one that's often being cited in this instance. The World Bank president has made that proposal, the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa as well. But given the fact that a lot of African countries have been tapping global commercial markets for debt for a while now, for the better part of 20 years, don't we also need to fundamentally rewrite those debt contracts to essentially bake these contingency clauses, for lack of a better word, into them?
Yeah, so this is, in a sense, the low-hanging fruit to be able to, in the future, for future debt contracts, to be able to incorporate these new clauses. And in fact, these kinds of debt standstills did happen, for instance, for the lowest income countries. Around COVID-19, there was something called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. And that happened, but it was only applied to bilateral debt. It wasn't applied to multilateral debt and wasn't applied to private sector debt.
How do we deal with FX risk? Because if we keep saying that, if the premise you're starting with is that we're still going to need access to capital markets in the future, fair enough. But how do we mitigate that FX risk going forward? Are there instruments, are there tools that we could use, or just perhaps even just go down the old-fashioned route and say, we're locking in a specific FX rate at this point in time for the duration of this contract, as long as this debt is on our books?
Yep, there are all sorts of types of potential solutions to this. Number one is the finance needs to be concessional, right? Very, very cheap finance, especially what some also call patient capital, not capital which needs to have an immediate quick return, especially for big ticket items like infrastructure and so on, which is really what most African countries really need and actually spend quite a lot of money on. There's this idea that African countries spend badly. That's not why these situations are happening right now. It's because they've had extra challenges like the pandemic to deal with, and also they simply don't have economies that are big enough to be able to kind of pool that kind of money domestically. So there's all sorts of solutions that can be brought into place. First of all, make the finance as cheap as possible so that you're not having to pay back lots of service all the time. Second of all, diversify in terms of the kinds of finance. Now, this week as well, we've had the Afri-Exim Bank meetings where there was a very strong call for a new mechanism for African countries to be able to trade amongst themselves without having to use dollars. So that kind of diversification, the dollar is effectively a monopoly right now in terms of currency markets. And so if you're able to try to use all other currencies for trading, for example, that also creates more opportunity for being able to then service in dollars if you have to.
But it would also require a measure of trust in others, especially from looking at it in the context of, say, for example, a Nigerian company trying to borrow in Rand, or a South African firm that might be interested in raising debt from a consortium that might involve Naira. To the extent that African countries don't necessarily trust each other's monetary policies, right? If you've got the Naira, for example, now, of course, it's shifting back towards where the market believes it should be. But if we're having this conversation in 2020, the Naira on the official market rate anyway was completely grossly overvalued. So to the extent that those monetary policy problems exist, borrowing in each other's currencies is going to be a bit problematic, isn't it?
I'm not sure necessarily that's the case, because especially with the regional integration project that we have, we've got the AFCFTA. This is just part one of a big shift that the African continent is making to actually generate a lot more trust across the board, a lot more trade across the continent, and that means a lot more investment and a lot more kind of financial reliance. There is talk about an African monetary currency. There's talk about an African monetary fund itself. So there are big ideas and solutions on the table, but of course they require political will, and they do require an amount of sort of risk taking initially.